Bible never tells us what happened to the giants. It doesn't say they were wiped out. It doesn't say they vanished. It simply stops explaining. Yet long after the flood, names still appear. Og of Bashan, nations that should not exist. This isn't a story about monsters. It's about what the Bible leaves unanswered. The flood is described as an ending, a complete judgment, a reset of the world. Water rises, the old world disappears, and when the waters finally retreat, Scripture tells us something crucial. Only Noah, his family, and the creatures with them survived. That is where most explanations stop, because immediately after the flood, the Bible does not return to the giants. It does not revisit the Nephilim. It does not clarify their fate. Instead, it moves on. Genealogies resume. Nations are listed. Land is divided. Human history continues as if the previous threat had been fully erased. But something feels incomplete. Because Scripture is usually precise when it wants to close a subject. When a lineage ends, it says so. When a people is destroyed, it records it. When judgment is final, the text makes that finality clear. Yet here, regarding the giants, the Bible does none of that. There is no verse that says, "And the giants were no more." No confirmation, no summary, no explanation, just silence. And biblical silence is never accidental. In Scripture, silence often marks a boundary, not an absence of meaning, but a refusal to elaborate, a place where the text stops walking with the reader. What makes this silence unsettling is what comes later. Because after the flood, the Bible begins naming lands, peoples, and kings with disturbing familiarity. Not immediately, not loudly, but subtly. Names appear that echo older fears. Territories are mentioned that carry an uncomfortable weight. Descriptions surface that don't align with the world supposedly cleansed of its former corruption, and the text does not pause to explain why. This is the pattern that defines the post-flood narrative. Not revelation, but omission. The Bible never reintroduces the giants as a concept. It never says, they returned. It never says, they survived. Instead, it allows their effects to surface without commentary. That is far more disturbing than a clear answer, because clear answers close doors. Silence leaves them open. From a theological standpoint, this matters. The flood is not portrayed as a partial judgment, it is described as total. So if remnants of the pre-flood problem appear later, even indirectly, it raises a question. Scripture never resolves for us. Was the problem completely removed, or merely restrained? The Bible does not correct this tension. It allows both realities to coexist. A world judged and renewed, and a world where ancient shadows still linger. This chapter is not about proving survival. It is not about asserting hidden bloodlines or speculative mechanisms. It is about acknowledging something more honest and more unsettling. That the Bible, by its own structure, refuses to tell us everything. It shows us enough to notice the problem, but not enough to resolve it, and that refusal is consistent. Throughout Scripture, when human curiosity reaches certain thresholds, origins of evil, mechanisms of corruption, but it does not annotate every consequence. And the silence that follows is not ignorance. It is intentional limitation. Because what comes next in the biblical narrative is not an explanation, it is a confrontation. And that confrontation will not be theoretical. It will be geographical, historical, violent. Names will appear, lands will be contested, commands will be issued, and the reader will be left with an unshakable feeling. Whatever the flood ended, it did not erase every trace. The Bible does not say why, it simply moves forward. And in the chapters ahead, we will follow the text exactly where it leads, without adding answers, and without forcing closure where Scripture itself remains silent. Before the flood, the Bible does something unusual. It slows down. In a narrative that often compresses centuries into a few lines, Genesis pauses briefly to describe a corruption so severe that divine intervention becomes inevitable. This corruption is not presented as abstract evil. It is described as a condition of the world, and at the center of that condition, a single verse appears, short, restrained, and profoundly unsettling. Genesis does not explain it. It simply records it. There were giants in the earth in those days. That sentence is not introduced with emphasis. There is no warning, no theological framework. It is stated as fact. The text then adds something even more disturbing, and also after that. But for now, the focus remains on the world before the waters rose. The giants are not described in detail. The Bible does not dwell on their appearance. It does not catalog their deeds. Instead, it tells us what they represented. They were not merely large men. They were not presented as myths or legends. They are associated with a breakdown of order, moral, spiritual, and structural. The Hebrew term used, Nephilim, is never clearly defined. That ambiguity is deliberate. Scripture does not anchor them to a single function. It allows them to exist as a symbol of transgression, something out of alignment with the intended structure of creation. What matters in the narrative is not what they looked like, but when they appeared. They emerge at a moment when boundaries are dissolving. When the sons of God and the daughters of men are mentioned together, the text is not offering biology. It is marking violation, boundaries crossed, roles confused, order disrupted. The giants are not introduced as monsters. They are introduced as evidence. Evidence that the world is no longer functioning as designed. Immediately after mentioning them, the Bible shifts focus. It does not continue describing giants. It describes human violence. The earth was filled with violence. That connection is intentional. The giants are not blamed directly, but their presence coincides with a world spiraling beyond correction. This is critical. Scripture does not isolate evil to a single group. It presents a systemic collapse. The giants exist within that collapse, not as its sole cause, but as a manifestation of it. And then comes a line that defines the entire flood narrative. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. At that point, the flood becomes inevitable, not because of giants alone, not because of forbidden unions, but because the entire structure of the world has become unsustainable. This is where modern interpretations often go wrong. They try to extract the giants as a standalone mystery, but the Bible embeds them within a much larger diagnosis. The giants are a symptom, not the disease, and symptoms disappear when the condition is treated. The flood, according to the text, is that treatment, a reset, a cleansing, which makes the post-flood silence even more troubling, because if the giants were merely symbolic of corruption, then their disappearance would require no explanation. But if they were something more, something tangible, named, remembered, then silence becomes significant. The Bible does not explain whether the giants were drowned. It does not say they were judged individually. It does not revisit them during the flood narrative at all. They vanish from the page before the rain even begins, and that absence is telling. The text chooses not to dramatize their end. It chooses not to satisfy curiosity. Instead, it shifts focus to Noah, a man described not as powerful but as different, blameless in his generations. That phrase matters. In a corrupted world, Noah stands apart not because of strength, but because of distinction. The implication is subtle. Whatever went wrong in the generations before the flood, Noah was not part of it. And when the ark closes, the narrative seals more than a vessel. It seals an era. The giants belong to a world that is about to be buried. Yet the Bible, even here, refuses to draw a final line. It records their existence. It records the judgment. But it does not explicitly connect the two. And that restraint prepares the reader, whether intentionally or not, for something that will come much later. Because when names begin to surface again, when territories echo ancient fears, when descriptions reappear that feel out of place in a cleansed world, the reader is forced to remember, the Bible never said everything was explained, only that judgment occurred. And judgment does not always come with commentary. The flood ends quietly. There is no description of bodies, no inventory of what was lost. The waters recede, the ground dries, and the Bible moves forward, as if the previous world has been sealed beneath the earth. Generations pass, nations form, borders emerge, genealogies stabilize. By every expectation, the story should now be clean. And for a long time, it is. Then, without warning, a name appears. Not in poetry, not in legend, but in a historical account, Og. The text does not introduce him as a mystery. It introduces him as a king. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. That sentence is precise and devastating. Remained. Not appeared, not rose, but remained. The implication is unavoidable. Og is not new. He belongs to something older. The Bible does not pause to explain who the Rephaim were. It assumes the reader already understands their significance. They are not described as monsters. They are identified as a people, a category that predates Israel, and Og is said to be the last of them. This is where the narrative tension sharpens, because the flood was supposed to mark a separation, a before and an after. Yet here, deep in the historical books, something from the before stands intact in the after. The text offers no bridge between those eras. It does not say how Og survived. It does not say whether he descended from someone spared. It does not say whether the Rephaim were fully destroyed. It simply states the fact Og exists. And more than that, he rules. Bashan is not a wilderness. It is fertile, fortified, strategic. Og is not hiding on the margins of history. He occupies a throne that matters. Because biblical villains are usually exaggerated, explained, framed, Og is not. He is presented clinically. His most famous detail is not his cruelty but his bed. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. The text gives measurements, not metaphor, not symbolism. Length, width, the bed is preserved as an artifact, a physical witness. This detail has puzzled readers for centuries. Why mention the bed? Why measure it? Because the Bible is grounding something abstract into reality. It is saying, this was not rumor, this was not myth. There was something about Og that required proof. And yet the text refuses to elaborate further. It does not connect Og explicitly to the Nephilim. It does not state that he is a giant in theological terms. It lets the implication hang. This restraint is intentional. By the time Israel encounters Og, the narrative focus is no longer cosmic rebellion, it is conquest. Israel is not warned that Og is supernatural. They are not told he represents an ancient threat. They are simply commanded to face him, and God speaks with unsettling calm. Do not fear him. That command only appears when fear is justified. Og is treated not as a legend, but as a military reality. A king whose defeat will matter. And when Og is finally defeated, the text does not celebrate. There is no triumphal language, no extended description of battle. His death is recorded briefly, as if the Bible is eager to move on. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If Og was truly the last of something ancient, why not explain it? Why not close the loop? Why leave his origin unresolved? The Bible gives us just enough information to recognize the anomaly, and then withdraws. Og becomes a marker, a reminder that the world after the flood is not as simple as it appears, that remnants exist, that history does not reset cleanly, and that divine judgment does not always erase every trace. Og's presence does not contradict the flood narrative. It complicates it. He stands as a living question, embedded within a book that rarely tolerates ambiguity. And after Og is gone, the text does something even stranger. It does not return to explain him. It moves on, as if the silence itself is the point. Og is defeated. His kingdom falls. His name fades from the narrative. And for a moment, it feels like closure. Israel continues forward, crossing boundaries that were promised long before any giant was mentioned. This is the land sworn to Abraham, a land described as flowing with abundance, a land meant to be inhabited, not contested. But when the scouts return, the tone changes. They do not speak first about cities or crops. They speak about people. The people who dwell in the land are strong. Strength alone is not unusual, but then the report sharpens. And we saw the Nephilim there. The word lands without explanation, no definition, no clarification. The text assumes familiarity, as if this name still carries weight. The Nephilim are not introduced as myth. They are observed, seen. The scouts do not say they heard stories, they say they saw them. And then comes the comparison. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is psychological confession. Fear reframed as perception. The land that was promised now appears occupied by something overwhelming. What matters here is not whether every scout saw the same thing. What matters is that the Bible records the claim and does not immediately refute it. There is no divine correction saying, they were mistaken. There is no clarification that the Nephilim no longer exist. Instead, the narrative focuses on Israel's reaction. Panic spreads. Faith collapses. The people rebel. The presence of giants is treated as a test, not as an error, and that silence is telling. If Og was an isolated remnant, this should have ended with him. But now the land itself is described as holding others. Not one name, multiple groups. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Imam, different names, different regions. Yet the descriptions overlap. Tall, fear-inducing, ancient. They are not clustered in one forgotten corner. They are spread across the territory, which means Israel is not facing a single anomaly. They are entering a land shaped by a deeper history. And again, the Bible refuses to explain how these beings exist. It does not trace lineages. It does not reconcile timelines. It simply reports encounters. Cities fall. Giants are defeated. Some flee. Joshua's campaigns are listed methodically region by region. And in several places, the text adds a quiet qualifier. The Anakim were left in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, left not destroyed, not erased, left. The conquest is described as successful but incomplete. The Bible acknowledges limits. Some giants disappear from the narrative, others remain in the margins. The land is given to Israel, yet traces of its former inhabitants persist. This is not failure. It is documentation, because later, centuries later, one of those names surfaces again. Gath, a city not fully cleared. A place where a giant will one day emerge, long after Joshua is gone. But the text does not connect these dots explicitly. It lets time stretch. It lets memory fade. And then, without warning, the past steps forward again. The presence of giants in the Promised Land reframes everything. The flood did not end their memory. Og did not end their line. The conquest did not fully remove them. Instead, the Bible records a slow disappearance, a thinning, a retreat into silence, which raises a question the text refuses to ask aloud. Were the giants meant to vanish suddenly or gradually? Because what disappears slowly leaves behind confusion, and confusion leaves space for fear, legend, and denial. Israel inherits the land, but not a clean slate. They inherit ruins, old names, old fears. And the Bible continues, never returning to explain the origin of these beings, never clarifying their nature, only noting where they once stood and where some still linger. By the end of the conquest narrative, the giants are no longer central, but they are not denied. They recede into footnotes, into place names, into remembered enemies, into silence. And silence, in Scripture, is never accidental. At a certain point, the Bible stops naming giants, but it does not stop giving commands. As Israel settles into the land, the instructions become more specific and more unsettling. Entire nations are listed, not armies, not kings, peoples. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes. The language is absolute, no exceptions mentioned, no gradual displacement described. The command is not framed as conquest for resources. It is framed as removal, and the reason given is not political. It is moral, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominations. The text does not dwell on what those abominations are. It assumes they are known, or worse, that they are unspeakable. This is where modern readers hesitate, because the Bible, which often argues, pleads, and explains, suddenly issues commands without elaboration. No backstory is provided. No detailed indictment is recorded, just a list of nations, and an order to erase them. The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, different cultures, different territories, yet treated as one category. Not because of who they are politically, but because of what they represent. Something incompatible. something dangerous. The text insists this is not arbitrary violence. It repeats a warning: the land will vomit you out as it did them. The land itself is portrayed as reactive, as if it cannot sustain certain practices. This shifts the focus. The issue is not Israel's strength, it is the land's tolerance. And the Bible never clarifies what exactly crossed that threshold. What is clear is that partial obedience leads to consequences. Israel does not fully remove these nations. They leave remnants. Forced labor replaces expulsion. Coexistence replaces separation. And the result is predictable. Influence spreads. Practices are adopted. Altars are built. Boundaries blur. The narrative begins to show cycles of collapse. Oppression, deliverance, relapse. The text does not say, because giants remained, but it also never says the problem was resolved. Instead, it hints at contamination, not genetic, but spiritual. The fear is not size, it is influence, which makes the earlier presence of giants more troubling. Because giants were not merely powerful beings, they were symbols of something ancient, something prickly, something that should not have continued. Now, entire nations are treated as carriers of a similar corruption, not because they are tall, but because they preserve ways of life deemed irredeemable. The Bible does not enjoy this moment. There is no celebration. The tone is restrained. Commands are given, then consequences are observed. When Israel fails to obey, the text does not rage. It records decline. And still, no explanation is offered, tying these nations explicitly to the giants. The connection is left implied. Names overlap, regions overlap, practices echo earlier warnings, but the Bible refuses to draw a straight line. It leaves the reader with fragments. Giants before the flood, giants after the flood, nations ordered removed, and then silence. The uncomfortable possibility remains that what survived was not a species, but an influence. That something old learned how to persist without drawing attention. That erasure was commanded not out of cruelty, but out of containment. And that incomplete obedience allowed something unresolved to remain in the land. This chapter does not end with resolution, it ends with restraint. The Bible moves on. History continues. But the rationale behind these commands is never fully unpacked. No final explanation is given, only outcomes, which forces the reader to sit with the question Scripture does not answer. If God ordered removal, what was he preventing? There is a moment when the Bible could explain everything, and chooses not to. After listing giants, after naming kings like Og, after ordering the removal of entire nations, the text simply moves on. No summary is offered. No theological footnote appears. No clarification bridges the gap. The giants fade from description, but not from consequence. This absence is not accidental. Scripture explains many things in great detail. Genealogies stretch 4 chapters. Laws are repeated with precision. Failures are dissected and revisited. But here, silence. The Bible does not tell us how the giants survived the flood. It does not tell us whether they were the same beings, descendants, or something altered. It does not explain why their presence after the flood does not provoke the same response as before. And it does not reconcile how a world reset by water could still carry echoes of what came before. The silence is consistent, which makes it intentional. Instead of explanation, the text offers fragments. A name here, a location there, a warning repeated, as if the reader is meant to notice patterns, not receive conclusions. This is uncomfortable for modern readers. We expect closure, but ancient texts often signal danger by withholding detail. In Hebrew storytelling, what is left unsaid is often more important than what is described, especially when the subject touches boundaries. The flood marked a boundary, before and after, corruption and restraint, judgment and preservation. Giants belong to the before, yet their names surface after, and Scripture refuses to narrate the transition. It does not say, "This is how it happened." It simply continues history, as if the explanation is either unnecessary or forbidden. This raises a possibility rarely discussed, that some knowledge was not meant to be preserved, not because it was false, but because it was dangerous. certain practices, certain origins, certain mechanisms. The Bible often avoids detailing forbidden knowledge. It condemns witchcraft without explaining rituals. It forbids necromancy without describing methods. It names abominations without cataloging them. Silence functions as containment, and the giants sit inside that silence. What Scripture does emphasize is outcome: fear, oppression, moral collapse, cycles of judgment. It treats the giants less as characters and more as markers, signals that something unresolved is present. The land reacts. Nations are removed. Israel struggles when boundaries blur, yet still no explanation. The text refuses to satisfy curiosity, which forces a shift in focus. This is not a puzzle meant to be solved. It is a tension meant to be felt. The Bible is less concerned with how something persisted and more concerned with what it does when allowed to remain. And that may be the most unsettling part, because silence transfers responsibility to the reader. You are not told what survived. You are shown what happens when influence is tolerated, when partial obedience replaces separation, when unresolved remnants remain embedded in daily life. The Bible stops explaining, but consequences continue, and that silence stretches forward. Through the judges, through the kings, through exile, the giants are no longer named, but the problem they represent never fully disappears. This chapter ends without answers, because Scripture leaves this space intentionally open, not to invite speculation, but to warn. Some things are not explained because explaining them would give them shape, and some threats lose power only when they are left unnamed. There is a point where the Bible no longer adds information, not because the story is complete, not because the tension has been resolved, but because the text has reached a boundary it will not cross. After the giants are named, after the nations are removed, after Israel enters the land, the narrative closes its mouth. No final commentary is offered. No reflection explains what became of those figures. No warning is restated. The Bible simply moves forward as if expecting the reader to understand that something has been deliberately left behind. This is not rare in Scripture. When the text reaches matters tied to forbidden origins, it often retreats. We see this with angels who rebel, with practices condemned but not described, with judgments delivered without procedural detail. The Bible does not document everything it knows. It documents what it wants remembered. And the silence surrounding the giants signals that the subject has been sealed, not erased, sealed. The difference matters. Erased things vanish. Sealed things remain, but inaccessible. The giants are never formally concluded. They are never said to be exterminated again. They are simply no longer discussed. This creates a literary cutoff. Before the cutoff, names, locations, conflict. After the cutoff, absence. Yet the world the text describes does not suddenly become free of fear, violence, or moral decay. Those themes continue, which suggests that what mattered was never the physical presence of giants, but what they represented: influence, boundary violation, power without restraint. The Bible does not chase the spectacle, it withdraws. And in doing so, it redirects attention. The focus shifts from ancient figures to present responsibility, from mythical scale to ethical scale, from beings to behavior. This is where many readers make a mistake. They assume silence equals irrelevance. But in ancient writing, silence often marks danger, a closed door, not an empty room. The Bible stops talking about giants the same way it stops talking about certain sins once named. Not because they disappear, but because repeating them would normalize them. So the text moves on, and the burden shifts. If something remains unspoken, it is no longer the narrator's role to explain it. It becomes the reader's role to remain alert. The Bible trusts that pattern recognition is enough. You have seen what happens when boundaries are crossed. You have seen what happens when corruption spreads. You have seen what judgment looks like. No further explanation is required. The silence is the warning. This is why later texts speak of vigilance, not curiosity, of obedience, not investigation. The Bible never invites its audience to explore what it refuses to explain. It invites them to avoid repeating it. And so the subject ends, not with resolution, but with restraint. The story continues. History unfolds. Empires rise and fall. But the giants are gone from the narrative. Not because they were solved, but because they were contained. And Scripture chooses to leave that containment unexamined. This is the final form of silence. Not ignorance, not loss, but authority. The Bible does not owe an explanation. It sets a boundary and steps away. And that boundary still stands. When the Bible stops speaking about giants, the land does not become neutral. That is the detail many readers miss. The text no longer names them, but it continues to describe resistance, cities that fall slowly, peoples that must be driven out little by little, opposition that resurfaces generation after generation. The land is inherited but not emptied. This is not framed as a mystery. It is presented as a reality. Israel enters a promised land already shaped by history. Altars exist, practices exist, ways of thinking exist, and the Bible is careful with its language. It does not say the land is cursed. It says it must be cleansed. That distinction matters. A curse is imposed. Contamination is inherited. What remains in the land is not described as monstrous. It is described as influence. Habits learned, fear remembered, power structures embedded. The giants are no longer present as figures, but their shadow shapes the terrain. This is why conquest is gradual, not because God lacks power, but because erasure is not the goal. Transformation is. The Bible repeatedly warns Israel not to adopt the ways of the nations, not because those nations are strong, but because their ways persist. Influence outlives presence. This reframes the entire narrative. The giants were never the final threat. They were the most visible symptom. What mattered was what followed them. Social order, violence normalized, hierarchy divorced from justice. These things do not disappear when bodies fall. They remain in systems, and systems do not die easily. This is why Scripture emphasizes obedience after victory, why laws are given after conquest, why memory is regulated through ritual, because what remains is not flesh, it is pattern. The Bible understands something modern readers often overlook. You do not defeat corruption by removing figures alone. You defeat it by refusing imitation. And this is where Israel struggles. Again and again, the text records moments where what should have been removed was tolerated, shrines left standing, customs adopted quietly, boundaries blurred. Each time, the result is the same. Instability returns. Oppression emerges from within. The land reacts, not with giants, but with cycles. This suggests that the legacy of the giants was never physical survival. It was cultural residue. The flood erased bodies, it did not erase memory. And Scripture is deeply aware of how memory shapes behavior. That is why it commands remembrance selectively. Remember this, do not remember that. The silence around the giants is part of that discipline. They are not celebrated, they are not analyzed, they are not mythologized. They are allowed to fade, but their effects are addressed indirectly through law, through warning, through consequence. The Bible does not dramatize what remained. It documents its impact. Fear that causes hesitation, power that tempts compromise, silence that demands discernment. The land becomes a test, not of strength, but of restraint. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because what remained in the land is not ancient, it is familiar. Influence without explanation, pressure without origin, presence without name. The Bible never says, this is what survived. It shows what happens when something unresolved is allowed to shape choices, and it leaves the reader to connect the pattern. The giants are gone, but the land remembers, and the responsibility now belongs to those who dwell there. The Bible never returns to finish the story. That is the ending. No final verse summarizes what became of the giants. No later prophet clarifies their fate. No tradition preserved in Scripture completes the account. The narrative simply stops. History continues. Names change. Empires rise. But the question remains untouched. This is not an oversight. If it were important for the audience to know what happened, the text would have said so. Scripture does not hesitate to explain when explanation serves its purpose. It explains exile. It explains covenant. It explains judgment. But here, explanation is withheld, which forces a conclusion that feels unsettling. Some answers were never meant to be recorded, not because they were unknown, but because recording them would shift focus from responsibility to curiosity. The Bible does not reward curiosity when it leads away from obedience. It warns against seeking knowledge that crosses certain lines. This story lives on one of those lines. The giants are not left unexplained because they are insignificant. They are left unexplained because they sit at the edge of what Scripture permits the reader to explore. Beyond that edge lies speculation, and speculation leads to distraction. So the text ends without resolution. It trusts that what has been shown is enough. You have seen what happens when boundaries are crossed. You have seen how corruption spreads. You have seen judgment fall and restraint imposed. You do not need to know how something survived. You need to know what happens when its influence is tolerated. That is the Bible's priority. This ending does something deliberate. It refuses to satisfy, and in doing so, it demands maturity from the reader. Children ask how. Adults ask what now. The unanswered ending shifts the question. Not, did they survive? But, what do we allow to remain? The silence becomes a mirror. The giants are gone from the page, but the reader is still present. The Bible ends its account not with fear, but with responsibility. It leaves the final step unspoken, because that step belongs outside the text. In the choices made afterward, in the boundaries enforced, in the silence respected. The story ends where explanation would begin, and that is the point. The Bible doesn't answer every question. Sometimes, silence is the boundary. And this is one of those silences.